Well, hello and welcome to the Movie Paradise. I am your host, Nathanael Molnár, and this is Movie Night Tonight. Every single week, we talk about a new film in depth, with each month having a new theme. We are currently in the month of November, and November's theme is action sci-fi films, and the movie we're talking about tonight is 1991's Terminator 2: Judgment Day. I am your host, Nathanael Molnár. I'm joined by a great panel today. I have with me Julia Spots.
That's me, Julia Spots.
Connor Murphy.
Hi.
And Iain Brouwer.
That's me, Iain Brouwer.
So, this is a full spoiler discussion. So if you have not seen T2, stay away from this discussion. Come back, watch the movie, and then come back to the discussion once you've seen the film, because we are talking about all parts, all aspects of this film in depth. So there will be spoilers.
Can I start with a question?
Go ahead.
Well, it's in a statement followed by a, what's that about? My statement is, I was not aware that the movie actually titled itself T2 in the very beginning. The title that shows up on screen is T2.
Yes. I think the formal name is Terminator 2: Judgment Day.
But it is in the movie. It says T2, and that's on the screen.
Yeah.
And I don't think Terminator 2: Judgment Day was on the screen. Am I wrong?
Maybe in the
I
final
don't know.
ending credits.
Yeah, in
At
the
some
credits.
point, yeah.
I pose a question as well. Is this the movie where he goes, "It's not a tumor"? Is that right?
There's no movie, actually, where he goes, "It's not a tumor." There's a movie where he goes, "It's not a tumor!"
It's not a tumor.
So let's get right into our discussion of T2, and let's go around the panel real quick and say roughly how many times we've seen the film and what our first thoughts, first impressions of the movie are, starting with Julia.
Ooh, this is me. So this was my first time seeing the movie, and gotta say, I loved it. My senior quote was Arnold Schwarzenegger, as everyone in the studio knows. No milk, milk is for babies. And I would just like to say that everything about this movie just got me. The Pepsi Man made a cameo.
So,
I've
Connor?
seen this film roughly one time, and I liked it a lot.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm going to say.
A lot.
Oh, good.
Just
that's
a lot.
it for tonight.
Yeah. Moving on to Iain Brouwer.
So yeah, that's, other than like YouTube poops, that's probably my second time seeing it. I remember when I was younger, I only knew the quotes originally just like from watching like just such quality YTPs. But then when I actually watched the movie, I was about 15. I loved it. It was great.
So Terminator 2, I've seen this movie, I don't know exactly how many times. It's been many times I've seen it. This is one of my all-time favorites. This is my top 10 favorite movies of all time. I love T2. This movie is just so exhilarating and fun. And I love that, similar to The Matrix, it takes the action and the adventure and all of that, and it weaves it in with a really strong narrative and strong themes. I think Matrix is to a bigger extent than T2, but I think it has really interesting things to say as a film, and it has really profound character development, especially with the Terminator. And I think you take a movie, which I like the first Terminator. I think it's a good movie. But I think T2 is wholly a better film, and it takes the things that I think James Cameron wanted to do with the first movie and cranks it up to 11. And he's really able to do what he wanted to do with the first movie. He really gets to do that with T2. So I personally think Terminator 2 is a very special movie, and I really like this movie a lot. So let's get right into it in discussing this film. And I think probably the most apt comparison to when talking about T2 is comparing it to the first movie.
T1.
Yes, T1, Terminator 1. And I think there are definitely some interesting things to talk about. On the show, a common point that's often brought up is we talk about how filmmakers and directors specifically, when they have a limited budget, you get better results. When they don't have an unlimited budget, when they're stuck with those smaller budgets, they are forced to become more creative in terms of what they have to do in order to get their vision across on screen. We talked about that with George Lucas with the original Star Wars movies. We talked about that with Peter Jackson with Lord of the Rings. Filmmakers who are limited in their funds and what they are able to do find creative ways to get around the budgetary restrictions and results in a better film. With Terminator 2, I think it shows that that's not always the case. James Cameron is given a far bigger budget. If you look in comparison, the first Terminator had a budget of $6 million. Terminator 2 had a $102 million budget. That is a steep increase.
I'm sorry. Was that the first? Was that like the original budget, or like you?
Yeah. So the budget, I think, originally for T2 was $12 million, which in comparison is double the budget the first Terminator had.
Yeah.
But then by the end of filming and everything, I think filming took 8 months to make T2, which for a movie like T2, that's a long time.
Yeah. I mean, how could they not like forget what they were making over the you know, like they get into it, they're like, yeah, we have like these are themes that's going to be throughout the movie. By month 8, you're like, action, right?
Exactly.
He goes.
Put an explosion there.
They go.
Which
he takes his skin
and
off.
nowadays in the age of Marvel movies, 8 months is for a big blockbuster film is kind of a standard window of time to film. But this is 1991. You know, you didn't have movies shooting for 8 months. In fact, I think I knew the number beforehand, but Terminator 1 took like a fraction of the time to film compared to this one. So in the case of T2, we see that when a filmmaker is given a bigger budget, because certainly James Cameron was restricted with the first Terminator, and that resulted in a really good movie. But when he's given a bigger budget and he knows he can do more with it, and he's given this groundbreaking CGI, which we'll get into later in the show, once he's given all these opportunities and these resources, the film is so much better. And of course, it's all subjective, but in my mind, everything is expanded upon in this film. I think the narrative is far stronger in this movie than the first one. I think the action and the stakes and all of that is so much bigger and better in this movie. And I think it shows that there can be an exception to the rule, that it's not necessarily an absolute that, the filmmaker with a lower budget is going to make the better movie. James Cameron proves that once given a bigger budget and more resources, you can do something truly spectacular.
Mm-hmm. I agree. That was a great movie. I haven't seen the first Terminator either, so I can't really give a viewpoint from there.
I don't want to get right into negatives, but I do have a point that I can bring up that might work well with the fact that you haven't seen Terminator 1. Should I just go into that?
Go right ahead.
All right.
Wherever you want to steer this.
So I'm going to preface this, and I know I always have negative things to say. I think
Really? I didn't notice.
I think
Never picked that up.
it makes for good discussion, which is why I tend to bring them up first. Like we can talk back and forth about what you have to say about the negative thing I have to say versus like, this was a good movie. Yes, it was a good movie. And then we're done. So, yes, this is a good movie. I liked it a lot. And I have a similar issue with a lot, and we're going to do this comparison later, but I find that, you know, one of the strengths of Aliens is that it doesn't use Alien as a crutch for exposition. It has enough exposition in it that it is very much a standalone movie, doesn't reference the first movie too much to the point of it being, you know, purely a sequel. You have to watch the first and then the second. It works on its own too. And I found that T2 does that a little bit less. T2 is leaning on the first movie as a crutch for exposition. And I'm interested to see what you think, Julia, having not seen T1.
Having not seen T1, I feel as though I could fairly well understand the plot of this movie. It was all pretty linear and made a lot of sense to me. I didn't have an issue with it, so
No?
I don't think it's using it as much of a crutch. I think maybe if you watch the first movie and then the second, maybe you might get that idea. But also, what do I know? I haven't seen the first movie.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I've seen the first movie, but I honestly can't remember much of it. I remember seeing it when I was probably like 8 with one
So
of my brothers.
what's your input on this then? did you feel at all like it was using the exposition of the first movie as a crutch? Like, was there missing exposition in T2?
My 8-year-old self would probably say no.
No.
I don't know. That's a thing.
No, I
I
mean,
highly regard 8-year-old movies.
Did you ever feel out of the loop? Did you ever feel like,
Not
oh,
once.
they're referencing the first movie, I don't know this?
Not really. I think the dialogue did a pretty good, it was pretty good in just telling what's going on while it was happening. There was a lot of that going on.
I think the only part that kind of really rolled you back to the first movie, and I only knew this because once I got home, I read the plot synopsis of the first movie, was when they were standing outside the ATM they were robbing, and he goes, yeah, my mom tried to blow up a computer thing. You know, computer
I don't
business.
think that was in the first one.
Oh, then...
I think that was a thing that
it was a
happened in
thing that was
between
mentioned just
Yeah,
in
so...
that one.
Okay, then...
So the one problem...
The one problem that I had doesn't exist, guys.
See, I felt like the scene where I really noticed it was when she had that dream about Kyle showing up in her cell. And
Okay, yeah, I didn't understand what was happening there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there were a few examples, I think.
Yeah, I thought it was maybe her dead husband or something.
I mean, that to an extent, yes. But I also feel like you're totally in the dark about who that is if you haven't seen the first movie.
Yeah, you have no emotional attachment to that character, so that scene didn't really do much for me.
Yeah.
See, I think the challenge that a sequel is always going to face is that you are continuing a story that's been started. You, as much as a sequel is trying to tell a new story, there are always elements of the story that had begun before. So Terminator 2 definitely tells a new story about these characters that we were introduced beforehand. The characters have evolved. Certainly, Sarah Connor has completely changed from who she was in Terminator 1, which is just kind of like the scared, helpless person running around in a situation that she doesn't understand, to now she is this, really built, tough person who is ready for war and ready for battle.
Yeah, she's so cool. She's got such muscle definition.
Exactly.
Have you seen her chest muscles?
I do think that it was a very smart direction for them to go, not making it about her as the main character. Because I think if she was the main character and they just threw her in as a totally changed person, it would have been jarring from the first movie. I think the fact that they started with a new main character that you didn't know anything about from the first movie because he didn't exist yet.
Yeah.
That was a smart move that made it, a good separate piece of content, which was important. And the fact that she was a side character was kind of just a nod back to the first one almost.
But I think the line that sequels walk is telling new stories while also keeping in mind the stories that have come before. And I don't think it's reasonable for a sequel to completely throw out any pre-existing understanding or context of the movies that have come before. I think that's unreasonable for them. I think you can make sequels, and I think T2 and the fact that Julie and Ian either have not seen Terminator 1 or don't remember Terminator 1 that well, the fact that you can watch T2 and get 95% of it without seeing the first Terminator means that they did their job. There are going to be elements of any sequel that hinge on the first one, but that's because they are sequels.
Explain Shrek 2 then.
They're expanding upon the story. In the case of Aliens, you said that it doesn't rely on the first one as a crutch as much, which narratively, yes, I agree, but all the emotion of the movie comes from understanding what happened to Ripley in that first movie, and so much of the first act hinges on understanding that. The points of the movie are still communicated, but it hits home so much more once you understand exactly what happened to her in the first movie. And I think the case can be made for T2, is that you can understand the beats of the movie and the story beats and what's going on, but it means so much more, and the emotion is there once you understand the context of the first film. Like that whole scene with Kyle Reese is that Julia, having not seen the first one, can watch it and she's like, okay, it's a scene, and just kind of throws it away and just moves on with the story, and you can still completely get the whole movie and enjoy it and appreciate it for what it is. But for us who have seen the first one and we understand the significance of what that means so much more.
Yeah.
So I don't think a sequel has to completely abandon anything that the first movie sets up. But I think a sequel can tell its own story and work on its own while also relying on some of the larger context of the movies that have come before.
On the subject of that scene, I'd like to bring up this point on the air as well as I did last night. This woman is built. How can't she run faster? I don't care. You know,
She does the second time around.
Yeah, when she's running to escape.
When she is ready to escape.
I mean,
she
to
runs
be
much
fair,
faster.
she's been locked up in this asylum this whole time, and all she can do are push-ups and pull-ups. So I'm sure
you can
she's
do wall
working.
sits for years.
And she also had
don't want
had a few vicious kicks to the ribs.
Yeah. Listen, I
she
know.
skipped leg day.
Yeah.
I guess
In
was
the-
it a
in-
dream? It was a dream, right? That she was.
With
Yeah.
calories.
Yeah.
Yes.
So-
Yes.
So it was,
I guess
it was
the
the dream
only-
air. It's
the-
thicker than real air.
Well, like, you know how you can't punch hard in your dreams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing, I think. But
Do you punch a lot in your dreams?
yeah, I get in fights a lot in my dreams.
Wow.
You guys, I think I have a lot of pent up anger. Guys.
Yeah.
I'm a very relaxed person in my waking life, but I'm just ready to brawl in my sleep.
Yeah.
So, Connor, having seen Terminator 1, and maybe Ian can chime in.
I'll probably just go off and say I have not seen Terminator 1 for the
Okay.
sake of...
Well, anything that comes to mind while
Yeah,
we
of
discuss
course.
this. Connor, how would you say that the themes of Terminator 1 are expanded upon or taken in different directions or highlighted in Terminator 2?
Before I say this, I wanna say one more thing to my last point, and I think that's that I have like an inherent and slightly personal issue with sequels in general. I think that I feel like the message, the themes of stories can have worlds built around them, and that tends to be done to better effect than using existing worlds to tell new stories. And I think that's somewhat of an opinion, and like I mean, it's definitely an opinion, but it's somewhat of like a personal preference thing. Mm-hmm. And I tend to have an issue with a lot of sci-fi as a result of that, and franchises. Although I have legitimate issues with franchises that are more business related than...
Well, that's because we hate corporations
Yes.
here at WXPL.
But
Yes.
I'd say my response to this, and I think this is an important thing to talk about, especially since this is the first sequel. Well,
Aliens.
we did Aliens, but we watched Alien beforehand. This is the first pure sequel that we...
Wait, is Aliens a sequel?
Yes, it's a
Oh,
sequel to
wow.
Alien.
Wait, have you not seen Alien?
I have not seen either.
Oh, okay.
I did see the chest buster scene.
Chest Burster.
Buster,
Burster,
buster.
yeah.
What's the difference? You know, one
There's a
letter, not
difference.
for me, buddy.
We Alien fans, there's a difference for
You
us.
need to have a certain level
Just
of IQ
getting across
to
the table,
enjoy
out of
Alien.
sight, out of mind.
But I think it's important to discuss the validity of sequels when talking about a film like this. And I'd say my response to what you just said is I understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, I think movies are essentially stories that we are telling. And stories, us as storytellers, human beings, we are in some way, whether it's a purely sci-fi world or if it's a gritty Oscar drama, we are trying to tell something about the world, something about our lives, something about us as people, and something about just society and the world around us. We're trying to communicate something through the medium of film. And I think that the notion that stories can only be purely encapsulated in one film goes against the nature that story is reflective of life. Because life is not contained to one story. Life goes on, and we have different points in our lives where something becomes the main story of our life. And then it moves on, and it changes, and it ebbs, and it flows. And I think in the same way, sequels take on different parts of the same story, the same overarching story, but take on different elements of it and different chapters in people's lives in the same way that life is. And I think to say that a movie can only be one self-contained story, that it can't go beyond the beginning of the film and it can't go beyond the ending of the film, I think goes against the very nature of film as a storytelling medium.
That's definitely a valid and well said point.
That was a very well executed argument, honestly.
Well,
Did you take debate in high school or something?
No, I just like movies and
He's
I discuss
passionate.
them.
I love seeing Nathanael in his element.
I do think, and I'll say a tiny bit of my corporate side of this argument, which is that I think that there's definitely a point where sequels become either self-indulgent or inherently capitalistic.
Oh,
money
I'm not
grabs.
denying that.
That's absolutely
I'm not denying
true.
that at all.
And usually not always, but usually the second movie tends to be less of this, and further movies tend to be more of it.
Once you hit 4, there's no going back.
Oh, yeah.
I gotta say.
I think it depends. Because I think it depends upon where the need for the sequel comes from.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you definitely have cases where the studio says, this movie made a ton of money, we need to make another one now.
Yeah.
And then the director, the first one goes, well, I don't want to tell the next story. There isn't anything else to say about the movie. And the studio says, okay, adios, you're gone, we're bringing in someone else. And
the studio actually says hasta la vista, baby.
Yes, I don't know how I didn't think of that. But that definitely does happen. But in the case of, say, T2, James Cameron, for years, over a decade, wanted to make another story. He thought there was more to tell in this world with these characters, and there was more in his head about this world that he wanted to tell. But it took so long because he didn't have the rights, and it took about 10 years for the rights to lapse or something along those lines. And then in 1990, he got the rights back, and he was able to do T2 in 91. But I think there are times where the story and the filmmakers feel like there's more story to tell, and then sometimes it is a corporate thing of a studio entity dictating that we need to make more purely because of money. But sometimes that might be the reason why the sequel goes into development. But then sometimes you can get a really great movie out of that. Sometimes something that is born out of all film is born out of we want to make money. That is where all movies come from.
I don't think that's true at all.
That is true because
there's an indie film scene that exists and people make movies as passion projects.
So that's a very tiny sect of filmmaking.
Well, it's becoming a lot bigger.
Okay, but
this is
your generalization has been.
We're getting nitpicky tonight.
Yeah.
Okay, so 97% of movies start from making money.
I suppose that's fair.
Okay,
I
think 97 is a fair thing to say. Generalization.
I don't think that the film industry started from a perspective of making money, and I don't think that I think that the place that it is going is becoming less and less about making money. The indie film scene is becoming bigger and bigger because people like the idea of making movies for reasons other than corporations and capitalism.
But you can't tell your story without money. And
No.
And you're only going to get money to make your movie if people believe that movie in turn is going to make money. That's the reality.
But
so
that's not the
I don't
reason
want to
the
get
movie's
into
being
a whole sidetrack. I want to keep it to T2.
Yeah.
But all that to say that there can be a narrative and story and character, reason and necessity for a sequel, and I think T2 embodies that. So then I posed a question. Having seen Terminator 1 and understanding there are definitely a lot of themes and messages and things in that movie that James Cameron wanted to communicate to the audience, I think Terminator 2, it kind of covers a lot of the same things, but it does it in a different way. How would you say that the themes and messages of T1 are expanded upon or whatever in T2?
So Terminator is a movie, I think it has themes of being careful about thinking that your actions are arbitrary and won't affect the future. It seems to have kind of a distilled theme that is sort of like The Butterfly Effect, the short story about the guy who steps on a butterfly and the whole world is run by a fascist dictator when he goes back to the future. And I think Terminator is kind of focusing on that idea that small things create big changes. The wars that we have now that seem like they're disconnected from us can eventually become something bigger. That seems to be like the main underlying theme of the first movie. And there's also like this side theme, or the theme that is happening between the characters, which is just kind of like a theme of human self-preservation. It's almost like a horror movie in that right, that the main action comes from Sarah Connor running for her life.
Yeah.
That, you know, there's not too much in the way of fighting back. There's just kind of her trying to survive this thing. It seems to just kind of have a theme that is the backdrop of the story. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I think T2 kind of takes a lot of those ideas and kind of goes in a different direction with it.
Yeah, it takes that backdrop theme and makes it very heavy-handedly in the beginning, like a forefront theme. I think I had a slight issue with how much it was layered on in the beginning. The exposition, which you said was filmed, like they did over 100 takes of one shot in that part.
Yeah, so the shot in the very beginning where the camera pans across all of the wreckage of Los Angeles in 2029 in the aftermath of this nuclear war, and then the Terminator crushes the skull and it tilts up, and you have the Terminator with the backdrop of all the carnage of the war. That was like over 100 times they shot that one take because Cameron wasn't satisfied with the way that the skull was crushed.
Yeah. Which, first of all, is just super self-indulgent, and I think it's ridiculous. I think that's what I think.
I don't doubt the tactics of a master.
Exactly.
If he needs 100 takes to get the perfect shot, I give the man 100 takes.
All I'm saying is, if you're gonna treat one part of the movie like that, treat the rest of the movie like that.
Yeah.
Like Kubrick. Kubrick treated an entire movie like that, and needless to say, people hated working with him because of that. But the movie turned out good.
I think I want to have that discussion, but I want to have it during a Kubrick film discussion.
I would love to have that, yeah.
Because his films deserve to be torn apart in that regard, because I think that part of his films is excessive.
See, the film industry attracts and is full of egotistical dicks.
Yeah.
To be honest, that is the nature of the industry. And I think when people are creating art, they get territorial over their art, and thus someone like James Cameron, Cameron's fully on the record, he is not the easiest person to work with. But I think in creating his art, he needs to be an egotistical dick. So there we are. I think it lends itself for it, and I think it's hard because it's hard to work with someone like that. But look at the results, and the result is a movie that has stood the test of time.
More importantly, also, though, I think that scene in the beginning is also somewhat excessive. I believe that it's sort of like the monologue in the detective film, the noir film, kind of clunky exposition. That is like, here is a thing, now let's get into the story, which I take slight issue with, but it can be a stylistic choice. There are a lot of, for Star Wars, it is a stylistic choice to have the scrolling text across the screen that you have to read the exposition, which in any movie that didn't make it a staple of their movies, it would be, excessive and clunky to have text across the screen. Honestly, if only the first movie existed and I saw that, I would tear it apart for that. I would say, you can't just make people read before a movie. That's
the first Terminator has a bunch of text at the very beginning.
Yeah, which is clunky and unnecessary. But I think that having this disconnected scene from the story, there's a story and it's going to happen, but here's a scene first about this is what the world is like. I find that to be a problem that sci-fi movies have.
I don't hate that part.
I think it's
I'm not.
Yeah.
They built a lot of the world, and now they're like, look at this world that I built. And then they tell the story. and it's unnecessary.
I don't see how that's an issue because because you have to understand what the movie's called Judgment Day, and it's all based upon we have to change the events of the past so that the future doesn't turn out like this.
Yeah.
And how can you get the audience to be emotionally invested in that we have to change the past if you don't show them what the future is like and you don't show how hellish it looks?
I feel like Sarah Connor's dream is the manifestation of that I find to be more effective.
See, I didn't think it was as effective because I think that starting point where you go into this movie and it's the first thing you see is this country torn. I think it kind of establishes a sense of urgency to the watchers to know that, this is going to happen if the characters don't change something. You don't want to see your world get torn apart. It's a little emotional connection. You need to establish that emotional connection, otherwise the watchers aren't going to care.
And when Sarah Connor is in the asylum and she's going off about, this is what's going to happen to the future, you're already dead, this, and that. If you don't have any of the context of this is actually what happens, that doesn't mean anything. She just looks like a crazy person.
That is fair. I just found that, and maybe there's a way that they could have done it that I would have liked more. I found that the beginning scene felt clunky. It felt like, here are some facts that you have to know. It was as good as having stuff on the screen to read, in my opinion. So it had the same problem as that, rather. It is better, definitely, than having text to read. But I find that it has similar problems in that there is a story and we're going to start it soon, but first we have to show you some exposition that isn't part of the story. It's just a backdrop for the story. Well,
it is part of the story.
It's like if you show the establishing shot of a house that a story all takes place in for a little bit too long. If you see a minute of the exterior of a house and then you go inside it and the rest of the movie's inside the house.
Well, that's just because nothing's happening on screen. You just have a house for a minute.
But it's
something
still
happening on screen.
It's still not. It's not part of. It's not the story beats that are happening.
Though I disagree with Connor, I will give him the credit for being able to argue this because if people raised points to me and I was the only person in a room where I was like just getting bombarded with points where it was like, no, I like it, all that, and going against me, I just feel like, all right, I'm done. I'm out.
No, this is not atypical of movie night tonight.
I am a stalwart.
But I enjoy
that
it.
word.
I enjoy the discussion. I do want to talk about in comparison to Aliens briefly, because I do want to move on to a different part of the discussion afterwards. But I do think there are apt comparisons to be made between Aliens and Terminator 2. I think if you look at the bare bones of the story, you have a main character who is then takes on a younger child and forms a connection with them. That's a theme that you see in Aliens with Ripley and Newt, and you see with the Terminator and John in Terminator 2.
Yes.
There's also, I thought this was interesting, and I hadn't considered this before. Both in Aliens and Terminator 2, you have a robotic character who was previously thought to be bad, who actually proves themselves to be good. You saw that with Bishop in Aliens, and you saw that with the Terminator in Terminator 2.
You're right.
And I think both have kind of similar, they go for similar things. The taking a character who previously was not a soldier and making them a soldier. Ripley is not a warrior in Alien. She becomes a warrior in Aliens. Sarah Connor was not a warrior in Terminator. She becomes a warrior in Terminator 2. When you break down the bare bones of the story, there are definitely very key similarities between the two.
You're right. Before you had started talking about the other key similarities, another movie that popped into my head was Logan. I felt like T2 was similar to Logan. The Terminator felt less robotic, less of a flat character, became more dynamic and had more layers underneath what he was doing. They even put it in the movie as they flipped the switch in his head to make him more of a human, just like Logan was made more of a human in Logan. And it was about family, protecting his family. this felt like a Western to me almost. Like the
Terminator 2?
Terminator 2. It felt like a post-Western where, this is so.
Yeehaw!
This is like so there was the era of Westerns that were cowboys as heroes defending the West, and then there was an era where Westerns were broken down. And there's a great video about it that I think we watched or I told you about.
Maybe.
And Logan is sort of like that for superhero movies, and I think that T2 is kind of like that for action movies. The action is there as a backdrop for this larger plot, this larger philosophical thing going on.
Yeah.
And I think that Aliens has that too almost. They grab a piece of, the establishment of the world. They grab like the corporation almost and bring that into sharper focus.
I think Cameron's very anti-corporate.
Yeah.
Because there's
Skynet.
definitely Skynet. You see that with Skynet. You definitely see that with Weyland-Yutani and Aliens. But I think one of my favorite parts about T2 is I love the journey that the Terminator goes through understanding human emotion. And I think this is probably one of the more profound parts of the film, is that constantly throughout the film, the Terminator is there, and you have that specific scene where the Terminator asks, "Why do you cry?" And John, the whole movie, John is trying to get the Terminator to understand what it means to be human. And the Terminator cannot understand this because the Terminator is not human. The Terminator does not feel pain. The Terminator does not feel any emotion. It's completely neutral to everything. And so the Terminator is trying to understand, because I think there is a component to it where the Terminator sees human emotion as a weakness. And that it is completely impervious, so therefore the Terminator is always going to be the best because it doesn't feel pain, it doesn't feel emotion, it's not stopped by these weaknesses. But I think by the end of the film, the Terminator realizes that it's human emotion that really makes humanity strong. And the Terminator says at the end of the film, "I know now why you cry."
Yeah, I'd just like to add that even thinking about that scene makes me feel very sad. And I feel tears welling up in my eyes.
With the thumbs up as he goes into the lava.
It makes me very unhappy to think about this scene. If you look very close into my eyes right now, there is water.
I think the thumbs up as he goes into the lava just like made me smile enough that it was like, kind of funny, and it made me smile enough that it was like, it was a little bit less sad. It helped ease the blow.
Not for me, buddy. I was ready to be waterworks.
But I think it all ties in with, I like how John Connor in the very beginning of the movie is a very unlikable character.
Yeah.
He's ripping people off, he's stealing money, he's a bit
brat.
He's a brat, he's a bit of a thug, you don't really like him. And then I think the fact that he is then, as a human being, tasked with trying to get this non-human entity to understand the capacity of human emotion and what does it mean to be human. I think John Connor kind of then, through that and being forced to answer that question, the Terminator so blatantly says, he's like, "You can't kill people. Why? You can't do this. Why?" Once John Connor is faced with such a broad question that I don't think any of us would have an immediate answer to. And then I think through that, John Connor kind of understands humanity more. And I think John Connor grows in that while trying to answer that question and trying to show the Terminator what does it mean to be human. John Connor kind of realizes the depths and the capacity of humanity and human emotion himself, and I think that's what shapes him to become the great leader that he will eventually become down the road in the years to come.
I also think it was very interesting seeing the chemistry between like John Connor and Sarah Connor, like the mom.
Their dynamics fantastic.
Yes, right off the bat, as soon as they ran into each other, he was already a leader. He was already kind of acting like a leader in the sense that he just already had this power over her, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, obviously,
The fact that he was given power over the Terminator too.
Yes,
helped a lot.
Especially in the car scene when like they're trying to like when John Connor got yelled at by her, and like the Terminator showed sympathy. Like you could see this little like look of sympathy, like why are you being this way to like John Connor, and like and I think from there, I think that also helped him understand just like the situation that they were in, and like it also helped him understand emotions, or being able to teach more emotions just by what had happened between him and his mother after being away for so long, and them finally coming together again.
I think the coldness of his mother in that movie helped him become a leader.
Definitely
as
shaped
well.
him.
Yeah, because he had to learn not to rely on his mother.
Yeah. I love the whole scene where she is going to Miles Dyson's house, and she's ready to kill him. And like his son is there pleading with her, don't hurt my dad, and she's like bloodthirsty, ready to kill.
Yeah.
She was ready.
She squeezed the trigger halfway before she even like
and
made
then
the
she
decision
has
not to.
and a beautiful moment of acting on Linda Hamilton's part. She has this realization, kind of like reality catches up with her, and she's like, wait, where am I? What am I doing? And she kind of just realizes what she was about to do. And I think it kind of goes back to a scene where John Connor was saying, like, I've seen my mother cry a couple of times, but she always makes it off to be like she's got something in her eyes. In that scene, she's bawling. And she is like, her head is pressed into John Connor's shoulder, and she's just sobbing. And it's kind of like she's built herself up to be this rock. And this, I think in many ways, she tries to shut out her own human emotion. I think she kind of looks at the Terminator and sees this is a way of strength in shutting out pain, shutting out emotion, all that. And essentially, she's losing touch with what it means to be human. And then I think in that moment, she realizes what that kind of turned her into. That she, losing touch with her groundedness and her sense of humanity almost made her do this really horrible thing. And then she kind of just opens up completely emotionally and kind of lets that facade of toughness go. And she just lets it all out. And I think it was a really beautiful moment.
She was more like the Terminator in that scene.
I think they even shot it in a way that made her look like the Terminator.
Yeah.
She looked
sinister looking.
She was more like the Terminator from the first movie than the Terminator was at all in the second movie.
Exactly.
So during that scene when Sarah Connor goes and like tries to kill him, first glance, the first time I saw the movie, I like kind of ignored what had happened previously before that, with them being like, "Oh, she's gonna go there, like something terrible is gonna happen." At first, I thought it was T-1000 as Sarah Connor, because
I could see that,
because she was stone cold. She was ready to do what she had to do, and until I saw emotion and hesitant, like her being very hesitant with even shooting in the first place, I was like, oh, well, that's Sarah Connor. But
I never even thought of that. I never even considered that, but that's true.
Yeah, I kind of ignored what had happened before that. I had kind of like not just glanced, and then seeing that, I was like, is that T-1000? Like, it was just...
That certainly makes a case for both her acting and James Cameron's directing. That's a great scene, as you can see her turning into something she's not.
Yeah. I think that's that's like an emotional peak in the film.
Yeah.
And I like that James Cameron took the opportunity that it could have just been straight action through the whole thing, and he didn't even need to go into these deeper messages and themes and concepts about what it means to be human. He didn't even need to touch upon that. But the fact that he did, and I think that you have Sarah Connor trying to shut out emotion and rediscovering her humanity, and then the Terminator also discovering what it means to be human, and how those kind of character arcs and character realizations kind of mirror each other and overlap with each other. I just think it was very beautifully done on Cameron's part.
I think that this movie is more about John Connor becoming John Connor than anything else.
Yeah.
I think these are the events that shaped John Connor into becoming who he ended up being.
Yeah.
So I think, the Terminator becoming more human honestly, the T-1000 isn't an important part of this film, really. It's
He's
kind
more of an oppositional force.
Yeah, and he just becomes a side character by the second half of the film when their goal becomes to, prevent the future from happening the way that they want it to, that Skynet wants it to. So yeah, he works as an oppositional force, but I think definitely it's two things happening at once, which is the whole group trying to prevent the future they don't want to happen, and John Connor becoming a leader.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with all that. I do want to talk about, speaking of the T-1000, I want to talk about the CGI in this movie. Because I think it's important. It's important to keep in mind the historical context of this movie, because CGI had never been used in a movie like it was used in this.
Yeah.
We watch T2 today, and we're so used to seeing CGI used in this way. It's used in like every movie. You look at any Marvel movie where you have characters doing things with their hands and transforming and things like that. That had never been done before on screen. In 1989, James Cameron made The Abyss. And in The Abyss, he had this scene where the water took on the shape of a face. And it was this really beautiful moment where the main characters are looking at this face that's been created in the water. And that was the first time that had ever been done, using CGI to create something like that. That had never been done before. And then that was 89, and then 2 years later, because that's one thing about James Cameron, is that he will make the technology to get done what he wants to get done. He is unlike any other filmmaker, he is a technological pioneer. And he will create a story, and if the technology is not there to tell the story he wants to tell, he will create the technology himself.
Weren't the machines and robots in the first scene, were they? I read up that they were actually
they were animatronics.
Fully functioning animatronics.
Yeah. And
for him to put so much effort into an opening scene that honestly didn't last a whole long time, and and honestly just foreshadowed, that's a lot.
Yeah.
You're putting in a lot to one scene already.
Yeah.
And so it progresses throughout the movie, and you can definitely tell.
Yeah.
That yeah.
But because in 89, because he did that with The Abyss, he felt like he could then do what he wanted to do with the T-1000 in Terminator 2.
And he did a lot.
Yes.
He really did a lot.
It's staggering. And I think there were a couple points where the CGI doesn't hold up the greatest.
I laughed physically out loud multiple times at this movie, guys.
So I'd say
there are definitely
a lot of it does.
Yeah.
A lot of especially
Right.
whenever his hand, the T-1000's hands would transform into
the long knife.
Yeah, any of those.
Is he an Overwatch character?
Any of that stuff looked great.
You're right, yeah.
It
was really only when his face did the thing.
He turned into the Pepsi Man.
That didn't hold up.
You also obviously have to put yourself in the shoes of someone in 1991 who has never seen something like that. Yeah, I look at it and I respect it, but the back of my mind, I'm like, oh, this looks goofy as hell. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I like to, with movie night tonight, I like to, whenever I can, bring in a historical perspective in terms of where these films are in the larger context of the history of film and how it progresses. But I think it would be a shame not to talk at least a little bit about how revolutionary the effects were in this movie, and how every single movie that we watch today that has any sort of CGI owes it to T2 for taking that step. And if it wasn't for T2, we wouldn't have the next big one that pushed the boundaries, which was Jurassic Park. And if it wasn't for Jurassic Park, we wouldn't have the next one that pushed the boundaries, which was The Phantom Menace and The Matrix, and it just goes on and builds on each other, and it goes back to T2, and it goes back to The Abyss. So I think that's a point that I wanted to bring up when discussing Terminator 2.
I think one thing to say about early sci-fi, though, and I think it applies a little bit less to T2, given that it was, the first to do it to that extent. And it might even apply more to more recent stuff, like from the early 2000s and mid 2000s, when CGI was ramping up to a level of being something amazing, and but it was still a little bit behind. There is something to consider about being careful about how you use sci-fi because of dating the film, because of there are definitely a few films from the mid 2000s that seem to have like they put in a lot of CGI, and it seems like they just didn't look at the fact that like technology is going to keep improving, and they just made something.
Well, I understand the spirit of what you're saying, but in terms of the practicality, there's stuff that's coming out today that's going to look outdated. Jungle Book, if you look at the Jungle Book, like today we watched the Jungle Book and we go, holy crap, how, like, that is just absolutely mind-blowing that they were able to create all that photorealistic stuff in a computer. In 30 years, we're going to watch the Jungle Book and probably we're going to cringe.
Really? You think so?
I really do think so.
You'll probably make fun of it.
Technology is constantly changing and growing and adapting, and there are things that, like, movies that came out 3 years ago that already look outdated. And I think I've struggled with this question myself before, because I feel like part of me, and this is kind of like, hindsight's 20/20. I think there are movies like, oh, if only they had just waited to make that movie when the technology was better. If only they had waited to make that. But how are they supposed to know that? How are they supposed to know that? We only know that because it's in retrospect for us, and we have the luxury to be able to say, well, this movie in 1998 should have waited until 2000 and whatever, when the technology was there to do what they wanted to do. But we have the luxury of being able to say that, looking at history and how everything plays out. I think if filmmakers, and again, I understand the spirit of what you're saying because I've thought this exact same thing before, but I think if filmmakers constantly think, well, I can't tell this story because this is not up to par of, like, the technology isn't there, I think
you'll end up with the first three.
Well, you'll just never remake it. You'll just never make the film.
And also, people watching that in 1991, they're probably, even James Cameron himself was probably just like, as they were doing the CGI and like once the movie's all done, people saw the movie, they probably thought to themselves like, it doesn't get better than this.
Exactly.
It won't get better than this. This is peak technology. This is peak, like, everything. And
like it or not, this is peak performance.
Yeah, this is what peak performance looks like.
So I think we only have the ability to say, clearly things do get better because we're looking at it in retrospect. I think case in point, what you were just saying about Jungle Book. You're saying, do you really think we'll in 20, 30 years look back and look at that as being, not nearly as good as what it is in 20 30 years? Because we constantly, in the state that we are now, think this is as good as it gets.
That's fair. But I do think that there are films from a few years ago, multiple years ago, that still hold up CGI-wise. Lord of the Rings movies, for example.
Yeah. Well, it's also a budget thing. It also depends upon how they use visual effects, where they put the money into the visual effects. There's movies like Lord of the Rings, visual effects absolutely still hold up today.
Yeah.
And then there's a movie that probably came out 3 years ago that don't look nearly as good.
That's fair.
And I think that's also because Lord of the Rings was like hugely revolutionary in terms of visual effects, and so it's really a film by film basis.
But I feel like at peak budget spent on CGI, we might have hit like a plateau. At some level, we have hit as good as it's going to get for a little while.
I believe that. I kind of believe that.
We might have, we were increasing, and now I feel like we might have hit a plateau.
And I feel like if you get over that plateau, maybe it'll just look like you're trying too hard to make it real, that it's going to be too noticeable.
I think there's always things that we're going to move on to. The thing we have not cracked yet is creating realistic-looking humans with CGI.
Yeah.
That's one thing we have not cracked yet.
I have a question. Do you know what they did with Carrie Fisher in
Rogue One?
Yeah.
Yes.
Like what
And
what
Tarkin
exactly
as
did
well.
they do? Yeah.
Well, so they had a stand-in with the dots on their face that they use for motion
that's what I was
capture,
thinking. Okay.
and then they use CGI to put Carrie Fisher's face on her.
And there was an uncanny element to it, I believe.
Yeah, I think
Slightly off.
for
it
Rogue
was
One.
convincing, like
it worked.
when you first saw it.
Well, the thing with the Carrie Fisher, or at least Leia in that scene, was that it was a fleeting shot, so it worked for that. It was barely on screen. The Tarkin thing I have a separate issue with.
Yeah.
Was that I thought it looked really good, but everyone knew that it was CGI.
Yeah.
And that I think for the amount of time that character had on screen, they should have recast the role and put in another actor.
Yeah.
Or do the CGI, but limit the role. Because the amount of screen time that character had for it being CGI the way that it was, I think it was too much. But that's a separate issue entirely. So, anyways, all that to say, technology is still completely changing, and we may think we're at a point where it can't get any better. But there are always things that are going to be better.
Yeah.
Like, I'm telling you, Lion King, we're all saying, this is absolutely phenomenal. This is like the greatest thing because it's so photorealistic. It looks so real, and it's all completely made in a computer. It will never get better than this. In 30 years, we're going to be looking at Lion King, and there are going to be parts of it. There are probably going to be parts where like that still looks great, and then there are going to be parts where we cringe.
One thing that I think is important to think about, though, is I won't make the generalization as the only thing, but I do think CGI, nothing comes close to how much CGI can make a movie look dated, can make a movie not hold up. I think that there are a lot of individual elements, a lot of stories from a lot of older movies seem slower. The story ideas have not been formalized yet before, 1960 or something like that. I don't know history well enough to speak to that, but movies from the 60s still seem to hold up pretty well. And it is very often CGI that makes a movie that would otherwise hold up very well not hold up well at all.
Yeah. Again, I understand the spirit of what you're saying, but there's also other elements to consider. Like, if you look at the way actors performed in movies in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, the mindset of an actor was so completely different because it was coming off of theater acting. And now we have a better understanding of the distinction between theater acting and screen acting.
Yeah.
There are so many different, and then costume design, production design, the innovations that later came from figuring out, like, developing the Steadicam with Rocky and all the movies that came before that tried to do some similar effect. Movies and the movie industry is constantly going through new innovations and changes, and I think I understand the spirit of it, but at the same time, filmmakers, if they get too lost in trying to think about how their movie is going to do in the future, and they need to focus on how can I make the best movie that I can make right now. And frankly, they have to worry about the moment. And it's going to require a lot of CGI, and maybe that CGI won't hold up in 20 years. But you're going to get completely lost and lose yourself and from reality if you're constantly thinking about what your movie's going to look like in 20, 50, 100 years.
You'll end up killing Miles... forget his last name,
Miles
because you're
Dyson.
thinking too much about the future.
Yes. So
Tie it back in.
So as we bring this discussion to a close, I'd like to go around and briefly say final closing thoughts on T2 Judgment Day, starting with Julia.
Well, I'd like to say that I'm glad I watched this with friends of mine.
Well, we're glad you
it was
could
a
join
very
us.
good movie. I enjoyed it a lot, and to all the listeners out there, hasta la vista, baby.
So you enjoyed the movie?
Yeah, that's
Yep.
what I'm saying. Yeah. Yeah, I'm done.
Yes. Connor?
And now I have to think of that other quote that he said. The one that he said like right away. I liked this movie a lot. I'm glad that I got to see it. I'm glad that I saw T1 first, but I am glad that I saw T2. It was a very good movie, and I understand why people think so highly of it.
Yeah. Ian?
I enjoyed the movie very much. Second time around, I understood a lot more. I grasped a lot of things I didn't realize. One thing I just wanted to say before we go off, one fun fact, is that the minigun used in T2 was the same minigun used in Predator.
Wow.
I
Whoa.
knew. Okay.
And-
Wow.
Okay. I thought they looked like they
Yes.
like. I thought
Yep.
it was the same kind of gun. I didn't realize it was the
Yeah,
exact.
1987,
That's awesome.
the 91. And also, one of my favorite things
That's
about
awesome.
the movie was the non-existent dialogue between Terminator and T-1000 other than the phone call when they faked voices of the foster parent and
Yeah.
John Connor.
Because that relationship wasn't important.
But it also, well, it kind of is, but it also intensified a lot of the scenes with the two of them in it. Just all violence, no dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it built up a lot of tension that obviously got released at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I liked it.
And so my final thoughts on T2 is, as I said before, it is probably my top 10 favorite movies of all time. I love this movie. I love the action and the adventure and how exhilarating it is, but I love how it also incorporates really strong and profound messages about the human experience and the human condition. And that is going to conclude our discussion of T2. Next month is the start of our holiday movie month. And the movie we're going to be talking about and watching next week is It's a Wonderful Life.
I've never seen that.
I've
haven't
never
either.
either. First movie night tonight, one that I have not seen.
I have to
so,
get my dad on your show.
So that's going to be a great
Old
discussion.
pops.
Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Thank you
no
for having
problem.
me
First
as
time
well.
around.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this discussion. Be sure to check out all of our various social medias at Movie Night TNT. That's Movie Night TNT. You can find all of our previous episodes up there. You can find, through our social media, you can find the links to all of those, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes. So until we talk about It's a Wonderful Life next week, everyone, thanks for listening.